Hey folks, Aaron Rabinowitz here for RedGiantTV.com. A few years back, I did a tutorial called Creating and Enhancing Text Wipe-On Effects. And at the time, it was the height of text wipe-on technology, of that I can assure you. But looking at it now, well, it could use a little something, I'd say. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we can rebuild it. We have the technology. So, get ready, because we're about to have a $6 million action-packed episode of Red Giant TV, where we'll learn to create this text-to-sand transition effect. Now, I got the basics set up for creating this effect from Petter Norby, the creator of the Trapcode product line. But to many, this project file, which has sat on his website for a while now, has remained a mystery. No, an enigma wrapped up in a mystery. But today, my friends, we will decipher the code and go from passive observers to active participants in the world of textual alchemy. Now, this effect relies heavily on Trapcode Form, a plugin we've covered in a few tutorials here at Red Giant TV. So, without belaboring it, I'll simply tell you that, like its older brother Trapcode Particular, Form is a particle generation system for Adobe After Effects. It works differently in that particles are always in existence, although they may not be seen, which is going to help us. And if you don't have Trapcode Form, you can always download a trial version from the Red Giant software website. Okay, so here I am in After Effects in a composition called Text Wipe. It's 5 seconds long at 30 frames per second. Also, its dimensions are 864 by 486. I have some text that uses the bevel and gradient layer styles in After Effects, but I won't get into how I set that up here. You could just as easily bring in a logo or text from Photoshop or Illustrator, or a rendered image from your 3D program. Now, I've also pre-composed the text layer with its layer styles into a separate composition. I did that because I'm about to add a linear wipe effect to my text. And if you apply that effect and many others directly to a layer that uses certain Photoshop layer styles, such as bevel, you'll get strange results. By pre-composing the text and nesting it here in this composition, After Effects sees the text not as text with the bevel layer style, but rather as a flat picture of bevel text. To learn more about nesting and pre-composing, check out my 2-part tutorial covering this at allbetsareoff.com. And for what it's worth, you don't have to do this with images or text that you bring in from Photoshop or your 3D program. This is only for my particular situation where I'm using text with live layer styles. Anyway, with my text pre-comp selected, I'll choose Effect, Transition, Linear Wipe. In the Effects panel, I'll set the wipe angle to -90. Then, I'll set the feather property to 20, which will blur the edge of the effect a bit. Then at frame 15, I'll set the transition completion up to 100%. And then, I'll set a keyframe by clicking on the stopwatch. Then in the timeline, I'll move down to the 4-second mark, and back in the effects panel, I'll set the transition completion down to 0%. A quick RAM preview, and we can see our text wiping onto the screen. Now I'm going to jump into my next composition called Build Up, also 5 seconds long, same dimensions, etc. I'll hit Ctrl-Y or Command-Y on a Mac to create a new solid, and I'll set the solid to be the same size as the composition. Also, I'll set the color to white. Then, with that done, I'll click OK to confirm the creation of the solid. With the solid still selected, I'll again add the linear wipe effect by choosing Effect, Transition, Linear Wipe. In the Effects panel, I'll leave it set to its default angle of 90 degrees, but I'll set the feather property up to 100. Then at frame 15, I'll set a keyframe for transition completion at its default value of 0%. Then, in the timeline, I'll move down to the 4-second mark, and back in the effects panel, I'll set the transition completion to 100%. A quick RAM preview, and we can see our white solid being wiped off the screen. Now, just so you know, this little animation we just created will be doing most of the hard work in this project. We're going to use it to drive the motion of the particles in Form, as you'll soon see. Now let's jump into our main composition, also 5 seconds long, same dimensions, same frame rate. From the project panel, I'll drop my text wipe composition and my build-up composition into my main composition. And then I'll move down in time to where my transitions have completed, and then I'll turn off their eyeball switches to make them invisible. Then I'll hit Control Y to add a new solid, and in the dialog, I'll name it Form. And I'll make it the same size as my composition. Color shouldn't matter. I'll click OK to confirm the creation of the new solid. Then, with the solid still selected, choose Effect, Trapcode, Form. Then, in the Effects panel, go into the Base Form settings and make the following changes. Set the size X to 864, and then set the size Y to 486. I set it to these values because this is the resolution of my composition, and I want the particles to be laid out across the entire comp. Next, set the particles in X to 864, and then set the particles in Y to 486, and then set the particles in Z to 1. Again, we're doing this so that each pixel of my composition has a potentially visible particle. We may not use every particle, or rather not every particle will be visible, but this ensures that if we need a particle visible any place in this composition, it will be there. As far as what determines which particles are visible or not, we'll cover that next. Go into the Layer Maps area and set the following. For color and alpha, set the pull down to our text wipe pre-comp. Then set the functionality pull down to RGBA to RGBA. This tells Form to use the color and the alpha channel or transparency channel of our text as the color and the alpha for the particles. Finally, set the map over property to XY so that it maps the color and alpha across XY space and not, for example, into Z space, which you might use in some situations. As you can see, we now have our text, but it's actually made up entirely of particles. But something is off about the colors. So go into the Effects panel in the Particle section at the bottom and set the Particle Transfer Mode from the default Add to Normal. Setting the transfer mode from Add to Normal ensures that the particles won't change as they overlap each other. But having done that, now you may find that your logo seems darker than it should when compared to the original, or more correctly, it's really partially transparent. And that's because Form is using a feathered sphere as the particle type or shape for each particle. By feathering the sphere, part of the particle is transparent. So if you go into the particle settings and set the sphere feather to 0, you're going to have better luck. Unfortunately, it's often not enough. I've found that even when I reduce the sphere's feather to 0, it still looks partially transparent. And I think that's because pixels are actually square, not round. So with each of the particles filling in for a pixel, a round particle won't fully cover the area of one pixel due to anti-aliasing. So here's what we can do about that. Choose Effect, Color Correction, Levels. In the Effects panel, set the channel pull-down to Alpha. Then tighten up the alpha input white to strengthen the alpha channel. Nice solution, right? Well, I wish I could take credit for it, but honestly, I got really stuck here. I tried a bunch of different things, and nothing was working. So I put in a call to Red Giant Software's co-founder and director of products, Sean Seyfried, and it wasn't like there was a stock answer for it, but we talked it out a bit, and I explained the problem, and he came up with the solution. Good stuff, man. Thanks. Okay, moving on. Let's get back into the Layer Maps area and go into the Disperse section. In there, set the Layer Property pull-down to our Build-Up layer, and then tell it to map over XY. Then go into the Disperse and Twist settings and set the Disperse property to 200. That will tell Form how much to disperse the layers based on our build-up composition. Let's do a quick RAM preview and discuss what that means. So basically, what we're doing here is telling the layer to disperse the particles based on our black and white build-up composition, using the brighter areas to push particles out and around while using the darker areas to keep them in place. So as different parts of the composition shift from white to black through the linear wipe effect, the particles go from being dispersed to sitting in place. Now the particles seem to fade into existence, but that's a trick. Remember, in trapcode form, the particles always exist. But in our case, At times, they're invisible because, remember, at the same time that we're causing our particles to coalesce into our text logo, in our text precomposition, we're also transitioning our text on through a linear wipe. And since that wipe affects the text alpha channel, our particles who are using the alpha channel of the text to determine their individual level of transparency appear to fade into existence as the linear wipe takes effect. By the way, if you recall, we also feathered the build-up wipe, and that's because we wanted the particles to somewhat gradually coalesce, or if we were reversing the transition, to gradually disperse. If there was no feathering, the shift from black to white would be very abrupt, and the coalescing or dispersal would not be nearly as natural. Speaking of which, now I think this is pretty cool, but it could use a little something to make it flow and twist more. In other words, to make it look a little more organic. So let's make some changes to some of the default form settings. Let's go into the layer map settings again, and then get into the fractal strength area. In there, set the layer pull down to our build-up layer, and set our map over property to XY. Then go down into the fractal field area and make the following changes. Set the displace property to 450, which will really help displace our particles a bit. Set the flow X to -30, which determines how far the particles flow into X space, and then set the flow Y to -30 as well. Finally, set the flow evolution to 20 to control the rate of the flow shape's evolution. Basically, this is lowering the rate of change for the shape of the particle displacement. For the moment, let's turn on motion blur for both the composition and the form layer so that we can see this in all of its blurred glory. Previewing this may take a while as it's calculating the motion of tons of particles, even invisible ones. Do a RAM preview, and we have a nice dust to text transition. To reverse this so that the text wipes away from left to right, you need to do the following. In our text composition, you need to set the linear wipe effects angle to 90 degrees, and then hit U to reveal the transition completion keyframes, and then select those keyframes and choose Animation, Keyframe Assistant, Time Reverse Keyframes, so that it now starts with a transition completion of 0% and ends with a value of 100%. Then, in the build-up composition, you need to set the wipe angle to -90 degrees, and then again reverse the transition completion keyframes. A RAM preview, and we have our text becoming dust. Also, if you want a change that's more gradual from text to dust, then we again have to go back into the text composition and set the linear wipe's feathering from 20 to 40. Then in the build-up composition, go into the linear wipe effect and set the feather from 100 to 200. A RAM preview, and we have a more gradual transition from text to sand. The point being here is that the more you feather the linear wipe, the more gradual this change will be. So play around with the linear wipe settings to see what you can come up with. Plus, you can use this with a lot more than just text. Personally, I like to use this effect to dissolve people and other elements in my shot. And as you'll see in an upcoming tutorial, you'll be able to use what we've learned here to create this awesome transition. Again, pretty cool as a text treatment, but also cool with people and other elements. And hey, remember, if you don't have Trapcode Form, but you want to try this out, you can always download a trial version from the Red Giant software website. And just for watching this tutorial, we're going to give you a discount on Trapcode Form. Go to redgiantsoftware.com/promos to get this and other special Red Giant TV deals. Now these are time-sensitive discounts. They won't last forever. All coupon codes expire 7 days from the launch date of each tutorial. So again, go to redgiantsoftware.com/promos to get the coupon codes for the most current Red Giant TV deals. Once again, I'm Aaron Rabinowitz for redgianttv.com. See you next time.